NCERT Medieval India, a history textbook for class 11. Satish Chandra. Chapter 1. India and the World. Many important changes took place in Europe and Asia after the 8th century. These changes not only altered the relationship between Europe and Asia, but had also a far-reaching effect on the thinking and pattern of living of the people. These developments had an indirect effect on India as well, since India had a large trade with the old Roman Empire. Europe. In Europe, the mighty Roman Empire had broken into two by the third quarter of the 6th century. The western part, with its capital at Rome, had been overwhelmed by the Slav and Germanic tribesmen coming from the side of Russia and Germany. These tribes came in many waves and indulged in a great deal of ravaging and plundering in the territories of the old Roman Empire. But in course of time, these tribes settled down in different parts of Europe, profoundly changing the character of the old population, as well as the languages and patterns of governments. The foundations of many of the modern European nations were laid during this period as a result of the intermingling of these tribesmen with the local population. The eastern part of the old Roman Empire had its capital at Constantinople. It included most of the Eastern Europe as well as modern Turkey, Syria, and North Africa. This empire, which was called the Byzantine Empire, continued many of the traditions of the Roman Empire, such as a strong monarchy and a highly centralized administration. However, in belief and ritual, it had many differences with the Catholic Church in the West, which had its headquarters at Rome. The church in the East was called the Greek Orthodox Church. It was due to its efforts and efforts of the Byzantine rulers that Russia was converted to Christianity. Modern Turkey and Syria, which were part of the Byzantine Empire, also followed the Greek Orthodox Church. The Byzantine Empire was a large and flourishing empire which continued to trade with Asia after the collapse of the Roman Empire in the West. It created traditions of government and culture, many of which were later absorbed by the Arabs when they overran Syria and Egypt. It also acted as a bridge between the Greco-Roman civilization and the Arab world, and later helped in the revival of Greek learning in the West. It disappeared finally in the middle of the 15th century when Constantinople fell to the Turks. For several centuries after the collapse of the Roman Empire in the West, the cities virtually disappeared in Western Europe, and foreign and inland trade received a severe setback. This period in Western Europe is called by historians the Dark Age. However, from the 10th century onwards, trade and with city life began to revive. Between the 12th and the 14th century, Western Europe was again able to attain a high level of prosperity. A notable feature of the period was the growth of science and technology, growth of towns, and the establishment of universities in a number of cities such as Padua and Milan in Italy. The universities played an important part in the growth of new learning and new ideas, which were gradually to lead to the Renaissance and the rise of a new Europe. Growth of Federalism, growth of Feudalism. A new type of society and a new system of government rose in Western Europe following the breakup of the Roman Empire. The new order that gradually emerged is called feudalism. This is derived from the Latin word feudum, which is translated into English as fief. In this society, the most powerful elements were the chiefs, who, with their military following, dominated large tracts of land and also played an important part in government. The king was just like one of the more powerful feudal chiefs. In course of time, the monarchy became stronger and an attempt was made to limit the power of the chiefs. One method of doing so was that the king swore the chiefs to an oath of loyalty to him as his vassals, and in return recognized the tract of land dominated by the chiefs as their fiefs. The chiefs in return could appoint sub-chiefs as vassals and allot a tract out of their fief to them. The king could, in theory, resume the fief of a disloyal vassal, but in practice this was rarely done. Thus, in the feudal system, government was dominated by a landed aristocracy. The aristocracy was hereditary and tried its best not to admit outsiders to its fold, but it was never a completely closed aristocracy. This was the feudal system in its broadest outline. There are many similarities between this system and the system of government and society evolved by the Turks in Central Asia and by the Rajputs in India. As the system developed, it assumed various forms in different centuries in different countries due to differences in conditions and traditions. In Europe, the feudal system is associated with two other features. First, in the system of serfdom. A serf was a peasant who worked on the land but could not change his profession or migrate to any other area or marry without the permission of his lord or master. Associated with this was the system of the manor. The manor was the house or castle where the lord lived. In many of the European countries, large tracts of land were owned by the lords of these manors. A part of the land was cultivated by the lord directly with the help of serfs who had to divide their time between cultivating their own fields and the fields of their master. Since the land belonged theoretically to the lord, the serf had to pay him other dues in cash and kind. The lord of the manor also had the responsibility of maintaining law and order, dispensing justice. Since there was a great deal of lawlessness in those days, even free peasants were sometimes prepared to accept the vassalage of the lord of the manor in return for protection. Some historians think that the system of serfdom and the manor system are vital parts of feudalism, and that it is wrong to speak of feudalism for societies in which these two do not exist. In India, for instance, there was no serfdom and no manor system as such, but the local landed elements, samantas, exercised many of the powers of the feudal lords, and the peasantry was in a dependent position to them. In other words, what mattered was not whether the peasantry was formally free, but the manner and the extent in which it could exercise its freedom. In many countries of Western Europe, and the manor system and the system of labor dues by the peasants disappeared after the 14th century. The second feature associated with the feudal system in Europe is the system of military organization. The most typical symbol of the feudal system was the armored knight on horseback. Actually, the system of cavalry warfare can roughly be traced back in Europe only to the 8th century. In the Roman times, the chief wings of the army were the heavy and light infantry armed with long spears and short swords. Horses were used to draw chariots in which the officers rode. It is generally believed that the mode of warfare changed with the arrival of the Arabs. The Arabs had a large supply of horses, and their swift movements and mounted archers made the infantry useless. The problems of developing and maintaining the organization needed for the new mode of warfare helped in the growth of feudalism in Europe. No king could hope to maintain out of his own resources the large body of cavalry needed and to provide them with armor and equipment. Hence, the army was decentralized, assigning to the fief holders the responsibility of maintaining a fixed force of cavalry and infantry for the service of the king. Cavalry warfare became the principal mode of warfare on account of two inventions, which, though much older, began to be used on a large scale during this period. The first was the iron stirrup. The iron stirrup made it possible for a heavily armored person to ride on a horse without falling off. It also made possible a cavalry charge with lances held tightly to the body without the rider being thrown off by the shock of the impact. The earlier device was either a wooden stirrup or a piece of rope which only provided a toe-hold. Thus it was now difficult for infantry to face the charge of heavy cavalry. The second invention was a new type of harness which enabled a horse to draw twice the amount of load it pulled earlier. It is believed that both these inventions came to Europe from the East, possibly from East Asia, and they spread in India from the 10th century onwards. Thus many factors, political, economic, and military, were responsible for the growth of feudalism in Europe. Even when strong governments emerged after the 11th century, the traditions had become too strong for the king to easily reduce the power of the feudal chiefs. Apart from the system of feudalism, the pattern of life in Europe during what is called the medieval period was also shaped by the Christian Church. We have already referred to the role of the Greek Orthodox Church in the Byzantine Empire and in Russia. In the absence of a powerful empire in the West, the Catholic Church took on some of the functions of the government as well. The Pope, who was the head of the Catholic Church, became not only a religious head, but one who exercised a great deal of political and moral authority as well. For the medieval age in Europe, as in West Asia and India, was an age of religion, and those who spoke on behalf of religion exercised a great deal of power and influence. With the help of grants of land from the princes and feudal chiefs and donations from rich merchants, many monastic orders and monasteries were set up. Some of these orders, such as that of the Franciscans, served the needy and the poor. Many monasteries gave medical help or shelter to travelers. They also served as centers for education and learning. In this way, the Catholic Church played an important role in the cultural life of Europe. However, some of the monasteries, which became exceedingly wealthy, began to behave like feudal lords. This led to internal discord and conflict with the rulers who resented the worldly power of the Church and owed the popes. We shall study in a subsequent chapter how the conflict between the Church and the state in Europe had an effect outside Europe as well. The Arab world. The rise of Islam was instrumental in uniting the warring Arab tribes into a powerful empire. The Arab Empire, founded by early caliphs, embraced, apart from Arabia, Syria, Iraq, Iran, Egypt, North Africa, and Spain. Following internal differences and civil wars among the Arab tribes, the Abbasids came to power as caliphs at Baghdad in the middle of the 8th century. The Abbasids claimed to belong to the same tribe to which the Prophet Muhammad belonged, and were for that reason considered holy. For about 150 years, the Abbasid Empire was one of the most powerful and flourishing empire. At its height, it included all the important centers of civilization in the area, viz., parts of North Africa, Egypt, Syria, Iran, and Iraq. The Abbasids controlled not only some of the most productive countries of West Asia and North Africa, but also commanded the important trade routes linking the Mediterranean world with India and China. The safety and security which the Abbasids provided to these trade routes was an important factor for the wealth and prosperity of the people in the area. One of the splendor and magnificence of the Abbasid court. The Arabs were keen merchants and quickly emerged as the most enterprising and wealthy merchants and seafarers in the world during the period. Numerous cities with magnificent buildings, both private and public, arose. The standard of living and the cultural environment of the Arab towns could hardly be paralleled in any country in the world during the period. The most famous caliphs of this period were Al-Mamun and Harun al-Rashid. The splendor of their court and their places and of their patronage to men of science and learning became subjects of numerous stories and legends. During the early period, the Arabs displayed a remarkable capacity of assimilating the scientific knowledge and administrative skills of the ancient civilizations they had overrun. They had no hesitation in employing non-Muslims, such as Christians and Jews, and also non-Arabs, particularly the Iranians, many of whom were Zoroastrians and even Buddhists, for running the administration. Although the Abbasid caliphs were Orthodox Muslims, they opened wide the gate of learning from all quarters as long as it did not challenge the fundamental tenets of Islam. The Caliph al-Mamun set up a house of wisdom at Baghdad for translating into Arabic the learning from various civilizations: Greek, Byzantine, Egyptian, Iranian, and Indian. The example set by the caliphs was followed by individual nobles. In a short space of time, almost all the important scientific works of the various countries had become available in Arabic. We know a good deal about the impact of great science and philosophy on the Arabs, largely due to the work done in recent years by a devoted band of European scholars. We are also beginning to have a better idea of the impact of Chinese science and philosophy on the Arab world. Many Chinese inventions such as the compass, paper, printing, gunpowder, and even the humble wheelbarrow traveled from China to Europe via the Arabs during this period. The famous Venetian traveler Marco Polo traveled to China in order to know more about it and to breach the Arab monopoly of Europe's trade with China. Unfortunately, we have only a limited knowledge of India's economic and cultural relations with the Arab world during the period and India's scientific contribution to it. The Arab conquest of Sindh in the 8th century did not lead to the establishment of closer cultural relations between the Arabs and the rest of India. The decimal system, which is the basis of modern mathematics and which had developed in India in the 5th century, traveled to the Arab world during this period. During the 9th century, it was popularized in the region by the Arab mathematician Al-Khwarizmi. It was introduced to Europe in the 12th century by a monk, Abelard, and became known as the system of Arab numerals. Many Indian works dealing with astronomy and mathematics were also translated into Arabic. The famous work on astronomy, Surya Siddhanta, which had been revised and reformed by Aryabhatta, was one of these. Works of Charak and Sushruta dealing with medicine were also translated. Indian traders and merchants continued to visit the marts of Iraq and Iran, and Indian physicians and master craftsmen were received at Caliph's court at Baghdad. A number of Sanskrit literary works such as Kalila wa Dimna Panchatantra were also translated into Arabic and formed the basis of Aesop's fables in the West. A detailed study of the impact of Indian sciences and philosophy on the Arab world and of the Arab sciences on India during the subsequent period is now being made. By the beginning of the 10th century, the Arabs had reached the stage when they could make their own contribution to the various sciences. The growth of geometry, algebra, geography, astronomy, optics, chemistry, medicine, etc. in the Arab world during this period made it the leader in the field of science. Some of the best stocked libraries in the world and the leading scientific laboratories were established in the Arab world during the period. However, it is necessary to remember that many of these achievements were the result of work done by people outside Arabia and Khorasan, Egypt, Spain, etc. The Arab science was truly international. It has been called Arab science because Arabic was the language of literature and thought in the entire area, and people from various countries could move freely and work or settle down anywhere they liked. The remarkable degree of intellectual and personal freedom enjoyed by scientists and scholars, as well as the patronage extended to them, was an important factor in the remarkable growth of Arab science and civilization. Such freedom was not available in Europe at the time due to the rigid attitude of the Christian Church. Perhaps conditions in India were similar, for hardly any of the Arab sciences could filter into India, and Indian science itself began to stagnate during the period. Arab science declined after the 14th century, partly due to political and economic developments affecting the area, but even more on account of growing orthodoxy, which shifted free thought, which stifled free thought. East and Southeast Asia, China's society and culture had attained a climax in the 8th and 9th centuries under Ang rule. The Ang rulers extended their overlordship over large parts of Xinjiang in Central Asia, including Kashgar. This helped in giving a fillip to the overland trade across what is called the Silk Road. Not only silk, but fine quality porcelain and works in jade, a semi-precious stone, were exported to West Asia, Europe, and India across this road. Foreign traders were welcome in China. Many of them, Arabs, Persians, and Indians, came to South China across the seas and settled down in Canton. The Ang Empire declined in the middle of the 9th century and was replaced in the 10th century by another dynasty, the Sung, which ruled over China for about 100 years. Its growing weakness gave an opportunity to the Mongols to conquer China in the 13th century. The Mongols wrought great death and destruction in China, but to their highly disciplined and mobile cavalry forces, the Mongol rulers were able to unify North and South China under one control for the first time. For some time, they also brought under their sway Tonkin, North Vietnam, and Annam, South Vietnam. In the north, they overran Korea. Thus, the Mongols established one of the largest empires in East Asia. The Venetian traveler Marco Polo, who spent some time at the court of Kublai Khan, the most famous of the Mongol rulers of China, has left a picturesque account of his court. Marco Polo returned to Italy by sea, visiting Malabar in India on the way. Thus, already different parts of the world were coming closer together, and their commercial and cultural contacts were increasing. The countries of Southeast Asia had to meet the expansionist urges of some of the Chinese rulers. China had developed a strong navy by this time, but during most of the time the Southeast Asian states remained independent. The two most powerful kingdoms which flourished in the region during the period were Sailendra and Kambuja empires. The Sailendra Empire, which arose in the 7th century and largely displaced the Sri Vijaya Empire, flourished till the 10th century. At its height, the empire included Sumatra, Java, the Malaya Peninsula, parts of Siam, modern Thailand, and even the Philippines. According to a 9th century Arab writer, the empire was so large that even the fastest vessel could not complete a round trip of it in 2 years. The Sailendra rulers had a powerful navy and dominated the sea trade to China. The Pallavas of South India also had a powerful navy. As before India had close trade and cultural contacts with the countries of the area, many Chinese and Indian scholars visited Palembang, the capital of the empire, which was located in Sumatra, which had been a Sanskrit and Buddhist center of study even earlier. The rulers built magnificent temples during the period, the most famous of them being the temple of Borobudur, dedicated to the Buddha. It is a whole mountain carved into 9 stone terraces, surmounted by a stupa in Indian epics such as the Ramayana and the Mahabharata. Continued to provide favorite themes for literature, folk art, puppet plays, etc. The book that I'm reading right now is a very old book of NCERT, so sometimes I can find words not clear, and sometimes the spellings of the words seem to be wrong, so I have to stop some time to look into and find the exact one. So you'll excuse me for the times I stop. Now I'm continuing from the part that I stopped. The Kambuja Empire extended over Cambodia and Annam, south of Vietnam, and replaced the Hinduist kingdom of Funan, which had dominated the area earlier. The empire Kambuja flourished till the 15th century and attained a high level of cultural development and prosperity. Its most magnificent achievement may be considered the group of temples near Angkor Thom in Cambodia. Begun in the 10th century, its ruler built a new temple there. To commemorate his memory, till about 200 temples were built in an area of 3.2 square kilometer. Of these, the largest is the temple of Angkor Wat. It has 3 kilometers of covered passages containing beautiful statues of gods, goddesses, and nymphs, apsaras, and skillfully executed panels containing scenes from the Ramayana and the Mahabharata. This entire group of buildings had been completely forgotten by the outside world and been largely taken over by the jungle, till it was discovered by a Frenchman in 1860. It is interesting to note that the most vigorous period of temple building activity was the period from the 10th to the 12th century, which was also the most magnificent period of temple building activity in India. Many Indian traders went to South China after traveling overland from the port of Takala in the Malaya Peninsula to the Chinese Sea. Many Brahmanas and later Buddhist monks settled there. While Buddhism declined in India, the land of its birth, it flourished in Southeast Asia. In course of time, it assimilated the Hindu gods into the Buddhist fold and even took over the Hindu temples, a movement opposite to what was happening in India at that time. Thus, India had close commercial and cultural contacts both with West and Southeast Asia. China, and Madagascar, and countries on the east coast of Africa. The various kingdoms in Southeast Asia acted as a kind of bridge for commercial and cultural contacts between India and the outside world and with China. Though deeply influenced by Indian civilization and culture, they were able to attain a distinctive culture of their own of a very high order. Arab traders who had been trading with South India and with the countries of Southeast Asia earlier became even more active after the establishment of the Abbasid Empire. But the Arabs did not displace the Indian traders and preachers, nor did they make any special effort to convert the people of the area to Islam. Thus, a remarkable degree of religious freedom and tolerance and the commingling of various cultures marked these countries' characteristics, which they have attained even today. The conversion of Indonesia and Malaya to Islam took place gradually after Islam had consolidated its position in India. Elsewhere, Buddhism continued to flourish. Commercial and cultural contacts between India and these countries were snapped only with the establishment of the Dutch in Indonesia, of the English in India, Burma and Malaya, and later of the French in Indochina.